your name?
By your name.
I'll send it.
Right.
Yeah,
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. My name is Aaron Huang, and I'm a junior here at Harvard College. I'm the chair of the Institute of Politics, Science, and Technology Policy Group, and the founder of Harvard's chapter of Student Pugwash, a co-sponsor of tonight's discussion. Now, I have to take this opportunity first to recognize and thank my colleague, Izad Jarudi, who's the president of MIT Student Pugwash, sitting above over there, who was instrumental in organizing tonight's forum. Now, the funny name Pugwash actually comes from the Pugwash conferences, first held in 1957 in the village of Pugwash, Nova Scotia. The stimulus for that gathering was a 1955 manifesto by Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, which called upon scientists to consider the threat posed by nuclear weapons. From that beginning evolved a continuing series of meetings all over the world with a growing diversity of participants and topics. Pugwash today focuses on those problems that lie at the intersection of science and world affairs. Student Pugwash strives to convene the next generation of scientists around today's parallel issues. Harvard, MIT, and Boston University's Student Pugwashes seek to extend the mission of the Pugwash conferences by engendering discourse about the role of individual responsibility in selecting a career and producing scientific and technological advances, as students will be the next generation of scientists. In conjunction with tonight's event, we will continue with the Northeast Regional Student Pugwash Conference to be held tomorrow here at the Kennedy School. We'll be exploring topics like the toll of conflict on the environment and civil liberties in wartime. All the events are free and open to the public, so for more information, please speak with any one of our student representatives. With that, I'm honored to introduce tonight's distinguished panel. As part of the IOP's mission to promote greater understanding and cooperation between the academic world and the world of politics and public affairs, tonight's discussion bridges the concerns at the intersection of academic research and national security. Moderating our discussion is a professor of environmental policy and the director of the program on science, technology, and public policy at the Kennedy School, Professor John Holdren. Trained in aeronautics and plasma physics at MIT and Stanford, Professor Holdren is chair of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control of the National Academy of Sciences and was a member of President Clinton's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology. Professor Holdren has chaired studies for the White House on protection of nuclear bomb materials, the U.S. Fusion Energy Research and Development Program, and Energy Research and Development Strategy for Climate Change Control, or Challenge. As chairman of the Pugwash Executive Committee, Professor Holdren delivered the Nobel Peace Prize acceptance lecture in 1955 on behalf of the Pugwash conferences. Professor Holdren.
Thank you very much. Actually, that Nobel acceptance lecture was 1995. I was only 11 in 1955, and would certainly have been a signal honor to have appeared in Oslo at that age. But I thank you for that kind introduction and also for those very accurate remarks about the focus of the Pugwash efforts, both internationally and the student Pugwash efforts. It's a privilege to be here tonight to moderate this discussion with an exceptionally distinguished and experienced panel. I'm going to make a few comments to set the stage, and then I will introduce the other three panelists in a bit of detail, and we'll launch into the subject matter in that way. The title of the forum tonight, The State versus the Academy, National Security versus Scientific Freedom, is certainly a provocative one and may be responsible for some of you sitting here tonight. But I think it is in some important ways misleading. Take the first part, the state versus the academy, as if those two were in a fundamentally adversarial relationship. I would argue that that relationship is not and cannot be fundamentally adversarial. The state needs the academy, and the academy needs the state for very obvious reasons in both directions. I'll elaborate on them a bit further. That doesn't mean that there cannot be tensions between the academy and the state. There are tensions, and we'll talk about some of them tonight. But if we ever find ourselves in a situation where the academy and the state are really in head-on collision, we are in deep trouble. And I would say the same thing about national security versus scientific freedom. National security needs scientific freedom, and scientific freedom needs national security. Let me take the second first, because it's perhaps the less obvious one. In times when national security is not assured, at times when our security is in peril, those are precisely the times that scientific freedoms, and indeed other freedoms, come under the most difficult constraints and attacks. But let me come back to the point about national security needing scientific freedom, because we sometimes make the mistake of thinking of this tension as if it were all about openness for science and secrecy for security, as if those two things, those four things, mapped onto each other directly: secrecy for security, openness for science. It is true that in some respects and at some times and in particularly focused ways, secrecy is required for national security. There are national security secrets that need to be protected, or we will become less safe. But it is also true that there are important benefits of openness for national security. The benefit of the access to international knowledge, which helps keep our own knowledge base on the cutting edge, which is essential for national security. International collaborations, that is, we have had over the last decade and have still today, cooperation between the United States and Russia on protecting nuclear weapons and nuclear materials so that they do not fall into the hands of terrorists. This requires openness of an unprecedented degree between the United States and Russia, and it certainly serves our national security to have that openness, rather than having Russia and the United States continue to protect all of the information relating to their nuclear weapons and nuclear materials in a way that would prevent them from collaborating. We had similar cooperation underway with the Chinese before the Wen Ho Lee episode at Los Alamos. That cooperation with the Chinese has basically been terminated, although there is interest in restoring it. But it's another example of openness serving national security if we think about it in the right way. The working conditions at the institutions that generate scientific progress and technological innovation, which includes our universities, but also our national laboratories, including the weapons laboratories. If we turn those institutions into armed camps preoccupied with secrecy, we will inhibit the scientific progress and the technological innovation on which our national security ultimately rests. So it's not so simple as secrecy for security versus openness for science. The issues are entangled in a much more complicated way. And I am sure that our three main commenters tonight will put some interesting specific flesh on these bones by talking about some of these interactions in more detail. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers before launching them on their talks. The first will be Dr. Charles Vest. He is the president of the institution down the street, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Your alma mater.
My alma mater. He serves as a member of President Bush's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology, and he and I served together on the previous administration's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology. He's a former chair of the Association of American Universities, former chair of the NASA Advisory Committee on the redesign of the space station, served on the Massachusetts Governor's Task Force on Economic Growth and Technology. He is a mechanical engineer by training, previously served as provost and vice president for academic affairs at the University of Michigan. He will talk for about 10 minutes on response and responsibility, balancing security and openness in research and education. He has written a most interesting report on this topic, which I think he may even tell you how to acquire. He will be followed by Dr. Sheila Widnall. She is Institute Professor and Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. She has served previously as the Associate Provost at MIT. She also served as Secretary of the Air Force from 1993 to 1997, chaired the Department of Defense Task Force on Sexual Harassment and Discrimination, received her bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree in Aero and Astro from MIT, where she was just a bit ahead of me. We knew each other in graduate school.
We were very small.
And she was, as many of you know from reading the newspaper, appointed last week to serve on the investigation board for the Columbia shuttle disaster, and just returned from Houston to be with us tonight. After Sheila's comments, we will hear from Dr. Barry Bloom. He is the Dean of the Faculty of the Harvard School of Public Health and Professor of Immunology and Infectious Diseases. He's a member of the World Health Organization Advisory Committee on Health Research, has chaired the WHO committees on leprosy research and tuberculosis research, and the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee of the UN Development Program, World Bank, World Health Organization Special Program for Research and Training in Tropical Diseases. He currently serves on the U.S. AIDS Vaccine Research Committee, the Scientific Advisory Board of the National Center for Infectious Diseases of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and on the National Advisory Board of the Fogarty International Center at the National Institutes of Health. If I were to tell you all of the qualifications and honors of our panelists, their time would be entirely consumed. So I'll stop with those brief introductions and turn the floor over to Chuck Vest to start it off.
Thank you very much, John. It's a real privilege to be here this evening to participate in a discussion of some extremely timely and important issues. The debate about security and openness is ongoing. I commented to my colleagues earlier that I suspect that we might have been having this forum even absent what happened to our nation on September 11th, 2001, because a whole lot of issues largely revolving around export control and scientific research were driving us to consider some of these same things. Of course, the last major spike in the debate and the tensions that John referred to were during the Cold War. During the 50s, Norbert Wiener once pointed out that to disseminate information about a weapon is to make it virtually certain that it will be used. That's one extreme position. A few years down the road from that time, Edward Teller has argued that secrecy is compatible with neither science nor the democratic process, and Senator Moynihan once even suggested that secrecy is for losers. So a question of openness and security, however, touches the heart of who we are as a nation and certainly who we are as great universities. To begin with, I want to state three things. First, that America's universities have a responsibility to act in our nation's best interests, and that's especially so in times of real danger and uncertainty, such as we occupy at this moment. Second, that I believe we must strive through mutually respectful dialogue to bridge the frequent gaps of understanding between those who are responsible for our security and those who teach and do academic research. And third, that poorly understood concepts like sensitive but unclassified or sensitive areas of study can very easily, one might even say likely, lead to bad policy and bad practice. So with those three statements as backgrounds, I want to address briefly three key issues: international students and scholars on our campuses, scientific materials, and scientific information. starting with international students and scholars. I deeply believe that the openness of American universities to foreign students and scholars has been overwhelmingly beneficial to our national interest and certainly to the excellence of universities like ours. It's also led to a better understanding of our system and our values abroad when many of these students and scholars return home. Now, today we're facing two primary issues, the tracking of international students and scholars and current or proposed limitations on what some international students can or cannot study. As you know, the SEVIS system, which has just come online, was designed to use information technology to gain a better handle over what we like to call directory information. This is very fundamental information about international students and scholars on our campuses, where they live, are they enrolled, are they full-time students, are they doing what they were granted a visa to do. This information has been provided by our universities for many years on paper, and every major educational association, including MIT, supported the implementation of this system. But the system is currently full of both technical and procedural glitches, largely due to its rapid deployment, and it already is displaying signs of the proverbial slippery slope as the amount of required information is beginning to increase. So care must be taken that we provide only the minimal required information, and we need to take care, I believe, as faculties and institutions to support and understand our international students and to treat them as full members of our academic communities. There's a very important issue, in my view, of division of labor. It's the job of the federal government to decide who may enter the United States to study or for other purposes. But once enrolled in our universities, we should not have to make distinctions between our international and our domestic students. Second, we are all obviously aware of and concerned about the so-called special registration procedures recently implemented for male visa holders from or born in a large number of predominantly Muslim countries. I consider this to be most unfortunate and unpleasant, but ultimately not abhorrent if conducted properly and fairly. But again, what concerns me most is the slippery slope that's again in view as the number of countries from which students and scholars and other visitors to the U.S. are subjected to these special registration procedures grows from 7 up to 25 now, and so forth. I should note, and some of you may have different information, that to date, reports within our own institution from our international students seem to indicate that while obviously and properly unhappy about being singled out by virtue of where they happen to be born as a group, they've been remarkably understanding of this process, and they also have generally reported that interrogations have been respectful and stuck to the kinds of issues that they had been led to believe would be discussed. But again, I worry that this is the kind of thing that can begin to cascade, and that over time, if we do not continue to provide a welcoming environment to international students, we're going to be lesser as a nation, and in the sense that John pointed out, ultimately our security will be less. Let me turn quickly to sensitive areas of study. As background, you know that in October 2001, Presidential Decision Directive number 2 was promulgated, calling for a government panel to determine a set of sensitive areas of study, that's the term used, that should be off limits to students from certain nations. Now, this is actually not an entirely new concept. There had for many years been a so-called technology watch list that triggered additional considerations by consular officers when they were interviewing and reviewing international students wanting to come to the U.S. But that, I believe, was implemented solely for the purpose of making those decisions and had no particular post-enrollment implications for our universities. The new framework is to rely on a group called the Interagency Panel on Advanced Science and Security, or IPASS, to implement this directive. The proposed task of IPASS has been widely understood by our community to be to determine whether students or scholars applying to enter the U.S. will engage in research activities that provide access to advanced science or technology of direct relevance to the development, deployment, or delivery of weapons of mass destruction. That is not unreasonable in principle, but of course it could have very bad inadvertent consequences. In my view, if it begins to move beyond criteria having directly to do with things like nuclear weapons systems, if it expands the criteria to begin to cover courses or classes rather than specific research and development activities, and certainly if it begins to apply new restrictions on students once they've already begun their studies. Ultimately, I believe that no foreign national granted a visa should be denied access to courses, research, or publications generally available on our campuses. The goal of the system should be to enable serious students to study in serious institutions and be treated like every other student. I understand our concerns about security. They're very real, but ultimately American science cannot be something for Americans only. I was asked to comment, and I will do so very briefly, by our organizers on the fact that was publicized in the newspapers not long ago that MIT had rejected a contract from the NSA because of restrictions placed on foreign students. That is in fact factual, but I'd like to point out that every year there are some small number of grants or contracts, whether with industry or government agencies, that in one way or another we cannot negotiate to a point that they fit our well-understood principles on campus. So this was not as singular an event as one might assume it was, but as I know Professor Widnall will emphasize, we will continue on our campus to put things through pretty clear filters. Now, scientific materials, universities should not be sources of materials that do harm. We must educate our students about security issues and responsibilities, and I think that should be melded together with health, safety, environmental responsibilities of good laboratory practice. Minimizing amounts of dangerous materials, accurately inventorying, tracking, registering of use, and don't work alone. These are just common sense things that have nothing to do with national security directives, but I think will take us a long way toward not inadvertently becoming a source of materials used to do harm. The government, as you know, is already moving to mandate new protocols for scientific materials with respect to a list of so-called select agents that could be the basis of biological weapons. And there are indeed background checks involved in the use of access to select agents for anybody accessing them. It's not something that singles out any particular national background. MIT and other universities, I'm sure, will comply with this legislation, but again, we worry about the slippery slope and frankly as much about just increasing regulation as anything and how rapidly the list will grow and will it get beyond things that we really are deeply worried about to others. Finally, scientific information. We also are facing new dangers and much more uncharted waters, in my view, with respect to the fundamental culture of science and research through possible restrictions on free publication of basic scientific information. Science is increasingly, of course, a collective and international activity. It thrives in openness, it suffers in isolation. But sharing of information that may be used, but open sharing of information, of course, can be used for good or ill, is at risk, and it always has been. In closed environments, research makes less progress, access to benefits is limited. With respect to scientific information, knowledge, or education, I believe restriction is rarely desirable and certainly rarely feasible in today's age of the internet and the World Wide Web. Restriction of access to certain so-called dangerous scientific materials that are highly damaging in small quantities, as I said, is, however, essential even in the absence of a terrorist threat. So we want to minimize the kinds of restrictions that may be placed on us, and I'd like to suggest a very simple-minded framework to begin thinking about this issue. I think we have different issues, first with respect to things like nuclear weapons and missiles, where the real issue is kind of technological know-how rather than basic knowledge, cyber terrorism, bioterrorism, and chemical or explosive materials. Restrictions on university teaching or on where our students come from, I think, are just simply unlikely to counter these threats in general. They depend largely on basic knowledge, and that basic knowledge can generally be used for good or will. Nuclear weapons, in my view, and John's an expert, are almost a singular case. And again, I think the major issue here is kind of technical know-how in terms of manufacturing capabilities and so forth that one normally acquires in an actual weapons laboratory as opposed to a classroom at Harvard or MIT. Nonetheless, it would be appropriate area for, this is an appropriate area for reasoned decision-making by IPAS, and we should depend primarily, in my view, on already existing security procedures. Going forward, I have three suggestions. First, that the federal government must continue to consult with the academic and scientific communities, and that we really all have to work at maintaining as much of a basis of common understanding and mutual respect as possible. Secondly, whenever possible and appropriate, and I tend to think that's most of the time, although I must admit that the biological area has some rather unique features, whenever possible, we should draw distinct boundaries between what is or is not appropriate to publish, and I believe that that should go back to essentially things being either classified or unclassified. This was the conclusion during the Reagan era when President Reagan promulgated NSDD 189 that said basic research should be open and scientific research should either be formally classified or it should be unclassified. It's these gray areas that I worry about and the increasing use of the concept of sensitive but unclassified that's so nebulous and gray and hard to understand. And third and finally, that we should rely as much as possible on voluntary agreements within the scientific community. And I'm sure you are all familiar with the fact that literally within the last several days, the editors and publishers of 32 key scientific journals have decided to put in place a scientific community approach to asking the question about whether in a given scientific publication we are over the cliff where the potential damage outweighs the importance of openness. And that's going to be really tough to do, but at the end of the day, I suspect it's a little bit like Winston Churchill's characterization of democracy as the worst possible form of government except for all the others. If we're going to worry about this issue, it's probably the worst possible way to do it except for all the others. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Chuck. We'll now have some commentary from Professor Sheila Widnall.
Okay. Well, I was asked by MIT post 9/11 to chair a committee to examine MIT's policies on research, issues of classified research, and the various kinds of restrictions on research that were very much on the minds of people in universities and in the government post 9/11. Although I do understand that even before 9/11, MIT was thinking that it was probably time to look at that area. I think what our committee report was entitled In the Public Interest, and I think we chose that title specifically to express that what a university like MIT and a university like Harvard do is fundamentally act in the public interest. Whether we're doing classified research at Lincoln Laboratory, which directly supports our national security, or whether we're conducting research and education in an open campus environment, that what we do is fundamentally in the public interest. In our report, we tried to strike a very explicit balance between our public service responsibilities to support our national security and what is really our ultimate public service responsibility for education and research on our campus. Our fundamental report was basically a statement of values and a clarification and articulation of the policies of MIT that flow from those values. We obviously point out that the essence of science is openness, that those who often suggest that one publish the results of a scientific investigation without the methodology simply don't understand science. And so, as I say, the essence of the scientific method is openness. We talked a lot about this issue of restrictions on research. We were certainly aware that MIT had, as Chuck mentioned, in many of these individual negotiations, especially quite recently with the government, that there had been a desire on the part of some contract monitors to go for a prior review of publication, for some desire to control, in some sense, who worked on the project, and MIT has in all cases refused those contracts and in fact has usually been able to reach agreement with the sponsor about what would an appropriate contract writing would be. The publishing of this report, which occurred just before we went into the summer, and to my knowledge, it really is the only document of its type that has been put out by a university. It really launched us into an endless round of dialogue that is going on in our country between universities, at the National Academy, with the federal government, with various federal agencies. I have testified to Congress. I have appeared. I've made a lot of speeches. I have frequent flyer points you wouldn't believe. And I've, basically trying to participate in this dialogue. And as Chuck mentioned, I think that is really the most important thing that can be going on right now. I'm certainly aware that some government agencies are trying to construct policies. But in the end, I see those almost collapsing like a house of cards as people attempt to develop a framework and develop a rationale and develop a methodology that would allow one to make decisions about what should be restricted and what should not be restricted. And in the end, trying to do that in the abstract, I think is really very difficult. So I think this period of dialogue is extremely important. I'm also coming to the belief that this word sensitive is in fact a technical term, even though it has not been defined. And so I've actually recommended to members of the scientific community that they do not use the term, at least as applied to research, because I think to actually use the phrase sensitive research indicates that one is buying into a framework which has not yet been defined. And when it is defined, then you have necessarily bought into that meaning. And I think that would really be a very bad idea. I think one thing that is different about these times is, in fact, the role of the biological sciences. The MIT Lincoln Labs was fundamentally an outgrowth of work that was done during World War II by the physics and engineering community. Much of that then transferred either to a place like Lincoln Lab or similar kinds of projects into the national labs. And out of that has grown a cultural relationship between the physics and engineering community and our national security apparatus. And there are advisory committees, sometimes at the classified level, and a great interaction between people in that community and the federal government. And so I think that the boundaries and the technologies are really well understood. I think we also understand the relationship of the findings of basic research to the industrial base and what it takes to apply the fruits of basic research into an application that has a national security implication. I think what is different about the biological science is first that there is really no cultural history of the best biological scientists having an active advisory committee structure relationship with our federal government. Indeed, there isn't even an obvious federal agency that is concerned about those kinds of issues. There is also I think, a fundamental shift in the relationship between the outcome of basic research and its application and the industrial base that is required to make those applications. And so I think that the only way that we can come to grips with these decisions is to have a really meaningful dialogue in the biological sciences with people in the government who are concerned about this potential for doing harm as well as doing good. I'm optimistic in the sense that I do see an enormous amount of dialogue going on. The presidents of the National Academy have issued a very strong statement which fundamentally supports scientific openness and also calls attention to this National Security Directive 189, which you'll hear a lot about, talking about a clear distinction between classified and unclassified research, and also calling for this continual dialogue. There is a series of committees and workshops being set up so that they will continue to have this dialogue. And so I'm hoping that in the end we will reach sensible positions, which I think can really only be done in some sense by the case study method. And you guys at Harvard are all very familiar with the case study method. So I think that's basically all I have to say.
Only at the business.
Only at the business school.
Thank you, Sheila. Let me turn now to Dean Barry Bloom.
I had really come with the great hope that we could have a real debate across between Harvard and MIT. And the sad thing is both President Vest's statement and In the Public Interest that Dr. Widnall wrote are superb documents. And I find it very difficult to disagree with almost anything there. Presumably, since I am the dean of the only faculty at Harvard that has select agents and has had to deal with some of the impacts of these laws, I'm here to say something about the peculiar nature of some of the issues in the biological terrorism business. And the first of them is the asymmetry. It was in 1972 that President Nixon allowed the United States to sign the Biological Weapons Convention. So in a sense, we have a longer culture of a commitment to the peaceful uses of science than almost any other part of science that I'm aware of. And that says that we cannot have mutually assured deterrence, because every country in the world knows the United States will not use BW to harm them. The second problem is the issue of dual use. I have no idea how to make a nuclear bomb, but I would bet you couldn't do it in my basement. And yet I could make a biological weapon. The machinery, it took 1 month for the DOD to set up a BW laboratory out west with commercial products off of commercial catalogs so that anybody could really do this, because the stuff that you need are fermenters and milling machines and stuff that are used in industry all the time to make cheese and beer and all kinds of other important things like pharmaceuticals. It's very hard to restrict access to those devices, so the import-export issue becomes a major issue. Thirdly, as Dr. Widnall pointed out earlier, there is a peculiar terror about infectious and biological agents. There were 17 people in the United States that got anthrax, 5 died, and this country is paralyzed, the post offices are still closed, partly because we don't know when they're safe and what this infection, what the end point of that is. I would just point out in terms of priorities, there are 36,000 people in the United States who died from influenza last year, and we have an absolutely super vaccine that could have protected almost all of those. So there's something quite an appealing target for terrorists. The former director of the CIA, who was on the National Academy Committee on Terrorism, defined the goal of a good terrorist and asked us to think like that, and I would not be a terribly good terrorist, is elegant simplicity. And the appeal of the biologic agents is they're already out there. The best agents we know about, you could, although they're select agents and classified, You could pick up West Nile by visiting Queens, and you could find a rabbit out west that has tularemia. Those are the 2 select agents we have at Harvard, and I've paid an awful lot of money to have them locked up and restricted. So the real question, the first question is, do these restrictions actually protect us? And I would say to the very largest extent, they really don't. If I wanted to be a terrorist, I wanted to train my students from my country to come to America, I wouldn't work on anthrax or one of these really difficult, organisms. You have to wear suits and all that. I'd work in E. coli. That's what everybody learned genetics. And the codes are so similar that the technology, the enzymes, everything to put a gene into E. coli is essentially the same to move genes around and anything else. The availability of the agents in the environment means it's very tough to say we're not going to study these agents except under classified conditions because they're actually real life threats. And that means the number of bright people we have studying them would be extremely limited, particularly if they were worried about whether they could publish their stuff or not. Finally, I share all of the views. Sensitive is a really risky category because nobody knows what it means. I feel that one of the strengths that both of their reports pointed out in the nuclear realm, the rigid classification, it was either classified and you couldn't talk about it, you didn't work on it in universities, but we have national labs devoted to do stuff that is classified. And the unclassified was all the rest of science, is very much more difficult to do, even to know what to classify. And we can come to that later in the issue of journal censorship. Finally, the issue then comes out to be, what do we really want to do? And who knows enough to be able to decide what the uses of science will be? And I would cite 4 examples that have nothing to do with terrorism. And it's a bit hyperbolic, but I think the point will be clear. We don't know how people will use the knowledge we generate. And that cannot be an argument for not generating knowledge. I don't think people were very interested in the 50s in whether bacteria had sex or not. That's the basis of all recombinant DNA, all molecular genetics, all of the biotechnology industry. That came from that question. I don't think anybody really cared much about why some little phages, viruses that infect bacteria, worked on some bacteria and not others. And the answer is, from those came the enzymes that enable us to sequence DNA, without which it wouldn't have been possible. I don't think anybody wanted to know whether if you stuck a cancer cell in a white cell that was making an antibody, it would stop it. What would be the use of that? I mean, it was a really dumb experiment. In fact, the guy who got the Nobel Prize told the student it was a really dumb experiment. But that's how monoclonal antibodies were discovered. And then when you found viruses that had similar sequences to stuff in the DNA of chickens, who would have believed that would be of interest? But that's the basis of oncogenes and all that we've learned about cancer biology. So I think that to start restricting a priori for what you think people are going to do, you can't really do in a good way. Finally, just what do you do? And I support all the suggestions, particularly dialogue, particularly communication. Stanley Falco, who is a really great microbiologist, has a wonderful line and says, ignorance is not a great defense. By providing shields to people learning about these agents, students, foreign nationals, we're creating ignorance in the best universities and among the brightest students. Then who is going to do the work here to protect us and understand what those threats would mean? I would argue that it is not possible in the biological realm easily to distinguish what is for the public good and what can be used for harm. And that leads to Dr. Widnall's last comment and my first comment. We have to create a culture of science where nobody would want to misuse it. The Biological Weapons Convention is weak because you can't verify it for obvious reasons, and we have no enforcement. You can slip a bug into the Queens Midtown Tunnel and kill everybody going in and out of that. How would you find it? How would you know who did it? What would you do about it if you knew it? The only way you can prevent it really is to change the culture of science, have the openness that everybody has as much access as everyone else to the key knowledge, with one proviso, and that is the weaponizing stuff, the actual worrying about things that might be deliverables, is not a fundamental scientific question. It's a technological one, just as it was in the nuclear business. And that's why we have national labs, and that's why we have classified research. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. As moderator, I have the privilege of asking one follow-up question of each panelist before we open up to the floor, and I'll make those quick so that we leave plenty of time. Let me start with Chuck Vest. Chuck, one thing that you didn't say much about was the issue of visas, the way we control not the information flow in and out of our country or our institutions, but the way we control the people flow. And it's my understanding that tightening visa requirements and prolonging the visa vetting process has in fact been causing some significant problems in American universities, as well as problems of other kinds. Foreign students who can't get back after going home to continue their studies, postdoctoral fellows who can't get in to carry out their postdoctoral appointments, and so on. I know that these requirements have posed problems in other areas, such as the kinds of international cooperation I've talked about between Russia and the United States, China and the United States, on protecting nuclear materials. Is that an issue that has come to the attention of PCAST or other entities advising the U.S. government on the implications and trade-offs inherent in this particular aspect of openness versus security?
It has not become a formal agenda item with PCAST. There has been some informal discussion among us, and particularly with people both in the State Department and OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And there are a couple points and a couple experiential points I would like to make about what seems to be going on. First of all, to kind of support the importance of dialogue, I will tell you that there are people inside the government who are at least as frustrated about this situation as we are in the universities. What appears to be happening is that the State Department, through its consular officers and so forth, have actually geared up a reasonably well-running machine to keep processing visitors' visas. But every time this technology watch list or some other factors, which I'll come back to, throw a red flag up, it now goes off to Washington and bounces around from one agency to the next, each of which seems not to have the foggiest idea in the world what to do with it. And so our experience at MIT with our students and our postdocs and so forth has been that ultimately virtually all of them have gotten into the country, but it's taken, according to our staff folks, about 5 times the hassle, time, effort, telephone calls, and numbers of letters that it took 2 years ago. Interestingly, the largest by far number of visa applications for people who had been admitted or invited as scholars that were rejected are from China. They are not from the Middle East. The primary reasons given have been so-called immigrant intent, which means we don't believe that this person is going to study and come back to his or her country. So we've just seen a lot of entropy generation and not much very useful work. We do have a couple of very sad cases. I've had some email correspondence with a student from Iran, a PhD student, in good standing, doing very well in his work, working in a field that I don't think anybody could claim in any reasonable way was related to potential terrorism, who went home to get married, was told by a consular officer in another country, 2 months and you'll be back in, and 9, 10 months later now he still hasn't. And talking about dialogue, I'll tell you what I've done with a few of those cases is I've taken those emails, expunged names and identities, and sent them to people both in the White House and State Department. They've been deluged with these things.
Okay. Sheila, you talked a bit about the dangers of this ambiguous, undefined category of sensitive sensitive information. It strikes me that this is an example, to the extent that the government is moving in the wrong direction from time to time, of a more general phenomenon in which we actually reduce the effectiveness of the secrecy we try to impose by trying to protect too much information, and as a result dilute our resources rather than spending the efforts we can devote to secrecy to protecting the most important stuff. You served as Secretary of the Air Force, and you've had a variety of other experiences that exposed you to a synoptic overview of what we protect and what we don't. What's your view on that topic? Are we as a nation trying to protect a lot more information than we need to, and as a result not protecting any of it
Well, I think
all that well?
Yeah, I think the issue of sensitive just comes from what I would call risk avoidance in the federal government, which I'm sure you're very familiar. I mean, there's the feeling that, that if you make a mistake and then something happens, you'll get blamed for it and your career will be damaged. So, I mean, I've been watching the formulation of policies in various federal agencies, and I put a lot of that up to risk avoidance. And I think MIT has been absolutely correct to turn those down in various cases. In many cases, it's just a kind of what I would call pop-up traffic on the part of a mid-level contract manager who just thinks that, he'll feel a little more secure if he has the right to approve publications that come out of say, a DoD-sponsored research. Actually, I think it's a waste of his time, and certainly it creates an enormous hassle for us. And in fact, in the case that Chuck mentioned, the work will not be done at MIT. Does that contribute to national security? I don't think so. That probably was very good work. Probably would have benefited the agency that would have sponsored it. I guess the other point I'd make about classified research is that the point of classifying research is not to put it in a box and protect it and nobody will ever see it. It's to create an environment where it can be exploited, where scientists and engineers can take that knowledge and exploit it. And I think the only defense there is that we have to run faster. One of the examples that I give of a piece of classified research which was ultimately made public is the adaptive optics. The Air Force developed adaptive optics for the purpose of sharpening up the intensity of a laser beam, and I won't say any more about that. But that also had application to telescopes. And the Air Force had this honed to really a fine art. And then the physics community started getting interested in the possibility of shaping the mirror in a telescope by, measuring with a laser the turbulent atmospheric properties. And, once you get the idea, you're 50% there. I think we all know that, any engineer or scientist. Once you get the idea, you're 50% there. So, I mean, once the idea was out and people started saying, well, now how would we do that? There was no reason to keep that work classified. And the Air Force just declassified it, put everything out in the open and declassified it. So I think the message there is you can't protect classified research forever. The purpose of classifying it is to run faster, develop it in a secure environment, and advance your technology, and restricting the early stages of the scientific process so that you drive away good scientists and engineers makes no sense at all.
It's the leaky bucket theory.
The leaky bucket theory.
It's more important to keep the bucket filled than it is to plug the little holes.
Okay. Barry, I'm going to give you an opportunity to generate the controversy with our MIT colleagues that you were looking for. I think I sensed one point of disagreement. Chuck Vest mentioned the very recent decision of the editors of a large number of the scientific journals to do, not to put too fine a point on it, some self-censorship in terms of what appeared in those journals. And Chuck, by referring to Churchill's famous statement about democracy, that it's the worst form of government except for the others, seemed to imply that while this procedure obviously has a lot of flaws, it might be better than nothing. That is, the procedure of journal editors banding together and deciding that they're not going to publish certain things. And clearly, looking at the journals involved and what they ordinarily publish. Most of this has to do with biology. My sense is that you might not agree that this is better than nothing, even in the sense of Churchill's dictum. Do you want to comment on that?
I'd be
by
happy
the editors
to.
and the
Yeah.
problems you see with it?
I guess I would question the motivation of what's under this and probably end up somewhere close to President Vest on the outcome, but for a different reason. None of those are first-rate journals. None of those is going to publish a paper that does not have fundamental new scientific knowledge, and at least in the life sciences, anything that is reckless is never going to get past an editorial board, a peer review, that would worry about, does this really contribute anything of major value to the knowledge in an area? So in many respects, I think it's a non-issue. What is an issue, and I think where President Vest really has weighed in, is if we don't, I think the logic is if we don't establish some sort of regulation, the government will, and they will understand a great deal less than the scientific community. So I'm not sure this is the right way to do it. I'd prefer an Asilomar model where the molecular biologists worrying about recombinant DNA didn't censor papers off the bat. What they did is convened a meeting and say, what do we have to know? What do we have to share with each other to know where the limits are? And that led to a lot of investigative stuff. This, I believe, is a desperate move to keep anyone in the government from really pouncing on us and imposing the same kind of regulations as we do on immigration of students on actually getting the work done. So in that sense, it may be the best example. If I may, I'd like to ask a question of the audience, and that is to give an example and ask whether, if I explained it simply, whether you would know whether you would want to publish that or not. And there are two examples. One is somebody, a good friend of mine, Eckhart Wimmer, created poliovirus in a test tube with no cells. That's the first creation of a quasi-living organism. Got a lot of notoriety, a lot of concern. Maybe you could have put something bad in that, and it would have made a dreadful weapon. And just think about it. If they didn't publish it, we would not know you could create life in a test tube. You know, not a bad milestone in science. Scientifically, a fairly trivial experiment, actually. The second is an experiment from Australia where people took a mouse pox virus, a model for smallpox, if you will, and put a gene in that they thought would increase the immune response. And it not only killed mice, it killed mice who were vaccinated against mousepox. And that was an example where people really did agonize, because that told you what you could put in smallpox and make it worse if mice and humans behave the same. What would you have done as an editor of those journals?
Well, we'll let people think about that and see if anyone wants to use their microphone time to answer. We're going to throw it open to questions from the audience at this point. We have two microphones on the floor. I'll alternate between them so you can line up behind them. We ask each questioner to briefly identify yourself, and we ask each questioner to ask a question rather than making a speech. And we ask you to direct your question to a specific panelist or panelists. We'll start over here on my left.
My name is Herman Sood. I'm at the Mass General. I'd like to ask Dr. Vest to expand a little bit on his concern about the slippery slope. Now, my understanding is that the United States government is now practicing on the basis that if a person, a government official, is accused of being a terrorist, that they are placed in a prison with no charge and no access to a legal counsel. And my concern is that this is being done right now apparently to non-U.S. citizens. But about this slippery slope, one, if we have a student here and somebody wants to put the finger on him and a government official accuses him, would it not be reasonable to be nervous that that student could be whisked off to a prison and never be seen for a long time period? And maybe this slippery slope is going to lead to this happening to U.S. students.
I don't see anything really to argue about or to respond to. That's precisely the kind of thing that I think we have to worry about this moving toward. I think in today's environment, that could happen with or without these special interviews that are being conducted. What's special about them is that they are conducted with a class of people based solely on where they were born, not even their citizenship. But again, I think the most sunshine, the most openness we can have, the most we understand the protocols that are supposed to be followed, the more we can be on guard. And let me just give an example of that. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, there were a very small number, and to the best of my knowledge, it was a very small number of students from Islamic countries who were from our campus, who were interviewed. And we were able actually to go on the web and locate the protocols that the Department of Justice had promulgated to the agents doing these interrogations. We were able to get hold of those and meet in advance with students to explain to them what the right questions were, what their rights are. So I think this is the kind of awareness we have to keep up, but the danger is very real in my view.
Good. Next question from my right.
Thank you all for showing up. My name is Bill McCamley. I am a second-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School. I'm from Las Cruces, New Mexico. My question revolves around the internet. The cliche is that never has so much information been available to so many people at their fingertips. So should the government or the scientific community be involved in any censorship of the internet? And if so, how would you go about doing that in such a medium where knowledge can flow so freely?
To whom is that directed?
Perhaps President Vest, since he's the one that talked about it.
My answer to that is no.
That's my answer too. No.
I suspect we all agree with that, and that makes it easy to make the answer brief. We don't have to address the question of method because the idea of controlling information on the internet is a bad idea. Let me say I forgot the most important instruction, and that's to us as panelists. We're supposed to keep our answers to 2 minutes so there can be as many questions as possible, and you did very well on that second one.
Made up for the earlier
On the average.
The next question is on my left.
Hi, my name is Justina Herta. I'm a junior at the college in government. My question is an easy one to ask, probably not as easy to answer, but I think for those of us, I don't know much about science. I've never taken a physics course, but I think I would like to ask this question for those of us who don't know as much about science, but want to know about what's happening and what could happen. So I'm going to give you two scenarios. One, we go to war sooner rather than later, so that the situation that you've described tonight is basically what you're dealing with. How will the government's policies change from what you've seen? What do you think the direction will be? Second scenario, we don't ever go to war, cross your fingers, with Iraq, against Iraq. And what will happen? Will the government back off after a while? Will it keep some of its policies? That's it. And
Do you have a particular person to
I feel like I should ask Professor Widnall, but I'd
Okay.
like to keep it
No,
open
that's
to
fine.
all three.
Okay, well, yeah, let me respond to that. I guess I don't think there's any relationship between the possibility of war and the policies governing the kinds of things we're talking about, which is basically research, education in our universities, the publishing of information. I think that those two processes have very different timescales. The process of openness and education in universities is a process with, a 10-year timescale. And I think that's recognized by the government. You said you didn't know anything about science, but let me just indicate that I think science is a really important force in our society, and I think that's recognized by the government. I think they understand that the scientific process is a dynamic, extremely productive process that has given us incredible economic benefits as well as social and human benefits. So I don't think there's any desire to harm the scientific process in any way. So as I say, I really believe that those two questions are quite separable. I don't know, I actually would not expect any changes in policy. I mean, I was around during the Gulf War, as I'm sure you were too, and I mean, I don't remember any fundamental shifts in policy. I mean, I was actually windsurfing in Aruba during the Gulf War, but, you know, I mean, we all watched it on television. It was no big deal.
Could I add just one very brief corollary to that? Sheila said something very important earlier, which is that the problems generally arise in sort of third, fourth level bureaucracies. And the one thing that might change under the tension and rapid pace and increased concern during a war is that while the policy might not change at the policymaker's level, the rapidity of decision making and the increased risk aversion at lower levels could cause a lot of trouble. That would be one thing that might change.
And the specific that I would add, I think it could make a difference in the visa issue that we were talking about.
Oh, sure.
If we go to war with Iraq, the concern will immediately ratchet up that we may be the targets of a terrorist reprisal. And I would expect the visa situation to tighten further in that event.
Especially for Middle Eastern countries.
Yes. Subrata.
I'm Subrata Ghoshroy. I'm a fellow at the Kennedy School of Science, Technology, and Public Policy in John's group. My question is primarily to Professor Vest, but maybe also Dr. Widnall, because it relates to MIT. One of the casualties of secrecy is, as John touched upon, is that over-classifying a material that relates to national security obviously causes a tremendous problem for oversight from the Congress and the general public. I was on the staff of the House Armed Services Committee and saw it firsthand a lot. And the question is, I've been reading in the New York Times and Boston Globe about this situation at Lincoln Lab where there was a classified report done by Lincoln Lab, apparently had issues that were raised by MIT faculty, and Professor Ed Crowley looked at the situation. So the question is, can you add any information to that, Professor Vest, and see if MIT is going to go through with a full investigation and bring all the stuff out in the open, or is it being hindered because of the secrecy?
I would say two things to that. One, the complexity of the process, and part of the reason that this is drawn out so long has had to do with the fact that you had classified documents engaged. That's just a fact. The only other thing I can really state is that we have, from the beginning, been very assiduously following the fully well understood published policies and procedures of the Institute for considering charges of scientific misconduct, and we are continuing to do that.
And I wrote those, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
So do you have any further comments?
No, I have no further comments. Well, other than the standards of integrity would be the same whether or not the work was classified. What we expect of our faculty.
Pablo.
Hi, my name is Pablo Suarez. I'm a PhD student at Boston University. My question is about the openness of academia regarding the concept of security. We're thinking now of security, national security within these borders, in terms of military stuff. Security used to be, and still continues to be, thinking about whether we will be alive and okay in the near future. There have been a transition in the concept of security from that traditional military aspect to a more environmental security, thinking of whether a changing environment could generate conflict. And then UNDP came up with human security, meaning will someone be able to eat next year, to be alive after a drought or some kind of other disaster, AIDS. So my question to Dr. Bloom is, are these events and these attitudes from government, state, and the media and ourselves changing the scope of research, narrowing down our intention of thinking on broader terms of security and narrowing resources into this very focused aspect of security?
It's a complicated question, and it's a sword that cuts two ways. I would have to say that there are a lot of people in the biologic sciences concerned that there is $1.7 billion in the federal budget added to my favorite institute, the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, to deal with bioterrorism. And that's at a time when there are many other diseases that are here and now and in developing countries, particularly poor countries where they don't have the tools to do the research, that are not being well funded. On the other hand, I have also to say that when President Clinton and his administration defined AIDS as a national security problem, it lifted that to a level of attention within the government and in the public realm and brought money that could never have happened from pure humanitarian concerns. It's a two-edged sword.
Thank you.
Next is on this side.
Hi, my name's Harpal Sandhu. I'm a freshman at Harvard College. First of all, thank you to all four of you for being here today. My question is for Professor Widnall. Seeing as how you've been involved at the elite levels in both science and government and the convergence of the two, I was wondering to what extent you thought there was still a military-industrial complex today, and what the role of the university is in that. And of course, my question is open to the rest of the panel, if they so desire.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's a complicated question. I think certainly there is a military-industrial complex. I mean, in the sense that we have a technologically advanced military, and they have a group of contractors that develop the weapon systems that they use. And so there is, in fact, a close relationship between the military and the technological possibilities that are put forward by the contractors, and ultimately, and there is an industrial base that, that works on the weapon system. I think I take that as, a fact of life. But that's only one part of our economy. That's only one part of our science and engineering. That's only one part of what happens at a university. Clearly, we're a much more diverse society than would be, sort of characterized as just the military-industrial complex. Also, it is the case, although I think that particular industry is having a tough time, that those companies are continually trying to find commercial applications for their expertise. And in particular, I happen to be very close to the space business. And we had programs to develop the capability for commercial launch vehicles. But that market is very, very soft, and it turns out that it's a tough business to be in commercially. But I think those companies are pushing commercial applications of their products to great benefit for our society.
Let me very briefly link the answer to that question a little more directly to one of the central themes of this discussion, which is the secrecy theme. I think one of the great positive attributes of the U.S. system is the amount of mobility that exists among sectors. The industrial sector, the academic sector, the government sector, people move rather readily in and out of these. And it makes it possible for people who have had experience with the industrial sector, with the military, with the weapons laboratories, to also take positions in universities, in non-governmental organizations in which they criticize and scrutinize the activities of those bodies. In a society where a great deal more is secret, it becomes harder and harder to do that. If people are working in an industry and can't publish anything of what they write, if people are working in a national weapons lab and can't publish anything of what they're doing, they find it very difficult to move, to get a job anywhere else, because nobody can judge their work. So there's a broad connection, I think, between the extent to which we have resisted excessive application of secrecy in every sector, a broad connection between that and the sort of mobility which keeps all of these institutions open to scrutiny. I think that's quite important.
Right, and I would just add that that's extremely healthy for our society and our economy.
And if I could add one more comment there, the least developed of those interrelationships is in the life sciences and the biological business. There has almost been no one to talk to in the government.
Exactly.
And I would support that there's a real need to create institutions where that could happen.
Good. Next is over here.
My name is Joy Asitis, and I'm the Director of Clinical Trials for an applied genomics company in Massachusetts. My question is for Professor Widnall.
For me?
Yes.
Okay.
Um,
I know nothing about biology.
That was a close call for Barry Bloom.
Don't worry, no quizzes about DNA. No. The question is this: a great deal of basic science research these days, particularly in the biological sciences, is taking place in industry, in private industry. My question is, does this present a security loophole for controlling sensitive research? And what would you propose from a policy perspective? The government, what role should the government take in that? And then, therefore, what are the potential legal and economic implications for the government overseeing publicly funded research?
You sure you don't want Dr. Bloom to answer that? I mean, from my point of view, and I'm not an expert in this area, but all the work that we've been talking about applies to government-funded work, so that the private sector is really exempt in some sense from all of those issues, except for export control. I mean, there's clearly an application of export control. So I would suspect, but then of course I would assume you're subject to the Patriot Act. I mean, there are laws with respect to the handling of particular agents. So there is a framework of law and regulations that is applicable to you.
But I think she's making a really interesting point, which is that one way to keep an area under wraps by the government is in fact to contract it to particularly small private companies that will agree to a certain level of secrecy that we may not in the university. And in my view, that's a very good way to slow scientific progress.
And the opposite is also true, though, where companies can partake in research, especially as Professor Bloom illuminated, that in biological research, there's a lot of commercial and practical applications that with very small alterations could be used for evil purposes.
Absolutely.
And without that kind of public control, I mean, to what extent can or should the government interfere with what private companies are doing and who they're hiring to help them develop these products?
That is an interesting follow-up, but we're not going to allow any more follow-up because we have a lot of people and we have 7 minutes left. Next.
Hi, my name is Sam Airy. I'm a graduate student at MIT. So I'll ask a question of my boss, Chuck, and that is, obviously, I should say, MIT has a very different role than any other university in this, in terms of its relationship with defense and security and research in those areas. So my question for you, Chuck, is, how does it make it different for MIT being in this position, having so much sort of past and current involvement with research and defense? And quickly, my question for Sheila Widnall is, a lot of talk has been going on in the government about restricting visas for students of certain countries wholesale. Do you have an opinion on that? Particularly Iran, Syria, others.
Well, to get to your first question, I would like to think that the primary influence, the long tradition going back to World War II of MIT with having fairly strong relationships with the Department of Defense and so forth, people going in and out of the government, research work at Lincoln Lab, and the strength that we've built. I hope the primary point is that this gives us that much stronger a voice to try to stand up for the principles that we think are important. And it's interesting you gave me the question because I think,
the question should be reversed.
No. The primary example really is the work that Sheila did, because they came out with a very straightforward report. These are our principles. If you want to play ball with us, here's what you got to adhere to. And our strength and our credibility in the government is really what allowed us to make that statement. I think a lot of other universities would not have been in the position to come out and take the leadership role that Sheila and the other faculty members engaged did. So I'd like to think that's the primary effect.
Sheila, quickly.
Right. Well, with respect to the issue of visas, I would obviously be very concerned about these blanket prohibitions. I mean, it's been my experience that, we are very changeable on what countries we tend to put on a list. I also have so many personal examples of students who have been educated in our country, who have absorbed our value system and really are out there as our friends. The National Academy of of Sciences and Engineering is now trying to open a dialogue with the Iranian Academy of Science and Engineering. I think that's all to the good. I think knowledge and fact-based decision-making and open democratic processes, those are the things which, if we can spread those all over the world, will ultimately be to our benefit. So I really don't want to cut anybody off from that. Sure, I want people who have high integrity to come to this country, and when they come here, they better behave themselves. But I just don't like the situation where we just blanket individuals from a particular country. I think in the long run, it's very destructive.
Thank you. The next one on my left.
Hi, I'm Ed Fredkin. I'm a visitor at MIT and on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon. Mine's for Barry Bloom. You suggested the idea of a culture of science where no one will want to use it to cause harm. Almost 40 years ago, when people were very worried about massive retaliation and nuclear war, someone asked Joshua Lederberg, what's the greatest threat to mankind? And his answer was the new virus. Sometime in the future, I don't know when, might be 10 or 15, 20 years from now, it will be within the capability of a single graduate student to concoct something which, when released, will essentially kill every person on the planet. I tried this idea out on David Baltimore, and he said, as long as you don't say how many years, I agree. Okay. So now what might his reason be? Well, that he's mentally not quite stable and perhaps was just jilted by his girlfriend. I've tried to see a way to avoid the possibility of this, and the only answers I can come up with are not like yours, but maybe converting some science into lost art, maybe giving up some ideas of academic freedom. Because what I see is that the capabilities from the knowledge and the technologies that we're developing, especially in biology, just obviously will lead sometime in the future to putting all of humanity at risk, clearly outweighing the benefits you get from what you might discover. So the question is, can you think of something beyond a culture of not causing harm in order to prevent those possibilities?
2 points. I don't agree with your judgment that the manipulation of life sciences in your scenario will have the potential for more harm than good. I just point out life expectancy in the United States in 1900 was 47 years. It's now around 77 or 78 years. The genetics of people didn't change over the course of a century, so that there has been an enormous improvement in life, quality of life, and whatever, a lot of which is attributable to science. I don't think you can make the equation that you made. I think there are inherent risks in anything we do in science, and we want to do what we can to minimize them. The second point is, yeah, anybody can splice a gene from almost anything into anything else now, and you don't have to come to Harvard to do that. And the two relevant consequences. One is, there's something called evolution. The probability of a mutant of anything doing better than the parent is exceedingly low, or we'd have been dead a very long time ago as a species. So that the vast majority of mutations in this life, or engineered naturally as opposed to artificially, just speeds up the process, are likely to be detrimental or not as good as you think it is. And that's why the BW people have spent so much time on stuff that's already out there. It has already survived evolution. And if we're dealing with that, then the third point is, then who do we get to go study those things that these evil fellows with their elegant simplicity are working on? Do we put our best students in best universities on that? Or will we just say that's too risky? I think the risk is on the other way, and that is not knowing enough to be able to defend ourselves.
We're only going to get one more question in because we've got about 1 minute, so I hope it's a short question and a short answer.
My name is Joan Krimlisk. I was a student in Radcliffe Seminars, and I have a question on technical research. How is risk assessed, whether it be classified or declassified, in terms of risk to the people doing the research, and who makes decisions in terms of which direction to go, given those risks.
And that is directed to Dean Bloom or?
President Vest.
President Vest gets the last one.
Great. I was looking at
You were
Sheila
looking
because
at
I
me.
thought you had a better idea. With the exception of things that have well-known protocols, for example, the use of human subjects, in which there are understood protocols, very clear regulations, required committees to review research before it's done, this is really an informal process. And I don't think, in general, we do an explicit or required risk assessment of the research. I think it's left up to the integrity of the individual investigators and their students. Would you say that's fair?
Well, let me add a
University?
comment. Let me maybe turn the question around a little bit. The nature of the work that gets classified tends to be, it's not because it's dangerous to the investigator. It tends to be because there are technical details about an application of basic research. It tends to be numbers associated with a particular application. So it isn't really a very formal process that involves any risk management of the danger to society or to the investigator. That I don't think that's really a part of it. It just has to do with particular aspects of a device that is used that tends to be classified.
There is a tradition at these events of closing them on schedule, and it's my duty as moderator to do that, with apologies to remaining questioners. I want to thank all of our panelists for their incisive contributions. I want to thank the audience for your good questions and your attentive listening. I want to thank our student Pugwash representatives for having the wit and the persistence to propose and pursue this topic for this forum. Thank you all very much.
Glad you were here. You could feel
Well,
the biology
I'm
coming.
very pleased to
They're
be here.
tough. They're tough.
Very